backed and powered by 150 years of business experience. Venue is a virtual data room trusted by the best of the Fortune 500 to move deals seamlessly from one to the other to the next too.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining today's roundtable, Healthcare Deals, Big Pharma, Megamergers, and IPOs, presented by The Deal and R. Donnelley. I'm Mark Aiello, Vice President General Manager for Venue, the virtual data room platform of R. Donnelley. During our discussion, you're welcome to submit your questions for the panel using the posting feature to the right of your browser, and if time allows, our panel will address them later in the hour. 2014 is going to be hard to beat, but this year's off to a solid start with multiple large deals, such as Shire plc's acquisition of MPS Pharmaceuticals for almost $6 billion, and more recently, Valiant Pharmaceuticals' purchase of Salix Pharmaceuticals for $14.5 billion. IPOs have also been pretty strong with this highly successful debut of Spark Therapeutics, which soared 95% on its first day. Joining me to talk about the healthcare sector are Darren Carroll, SVP of Business Development at Eli Lilly and Company, Adam Dolder, Manager Director at Great Point Partners, and Christian Hodnelin, Managing Director at William Blair and Company. So guys, before we sat down and the camera started rolling, we were chatting and you all expressed incredible enthusiasm about the pace of innovation that we're seeing. So before we talk about M&A, can we just set the table and talk about the space itself and what's going on, the force factors that are acting on this industry? Darren, I'll ask you to go first, please.
Sure. Well, you have to keep in mind at all times that we're in the innovation business, right? So here we're going to talk about the kind of deals that we see in the innovation business, but at Lilly and the other pharmaceutical companies, what we get paid to do is to provide novel medicines that actually can extend people's lives, can make those lives healthier, make people happier over the time that they're on this planet. We've got a long history of doing that. Certainly in the big pharma sector, Lilly, for example, has been in the business for 138 years. We got our start in large molecules, for example, by working in the insulin business. More recently, many of us in large pharma have gone through a tougher time where the labs weren't as productive as we would have liked them to have been. But in the last few years, last 4 or 5 years, we've seen Lilly and a lot of the other large cap pharma companies start to show some real productivity in the labs. We've seen that being matched now by some smaller cap companies as well. And we think it's that innovation that's got people excited. And what are they excited about? They're excited about the promise that in some areas is even curative, whether it's an insulin that can not necessarily cure, but really help bring diabetics into a much healthier state. But other areas like some of the new HCV vaccines that we're seeing that actually can be curative.
Great, thanks. Adam, what's exciting you about the industry today?
Yeah, absolutely. I would just follow on Darren's comments that I think we are at a time of fundamentally unprecedented scientific capability in drug development, and some of the things Darren was talking about, perhaps not seen for the past 100 years since the original antibiotics and viral vaccines were created. And originally with life expectancy that was maybe only 31 years old 100 plus years ago, today 80 years old. The disease states we're fighting now, cancer, cardio, other things like that, they are really, diabetes would be another example, they are diseases of aging, and that's what we're focused on today, attacking. And hopefully what we'll be able to create with novel new ideas, harnessing the power of the human immune system to attack things like PD-1, programmed death receptor 1, or using CAR T-cell therapies, really to drive continued innovation, to Darren's point, that we could see and replicate what was seen with Dr. Fleming's work around the original staph bacterial infection, that after that antibiotic was created, a 1,000-fold decrease in the mortality rate from bacterial infections over only 50 years. And we are hopefully on a precipice of some of those future discoveries as well.
Great, thanks. And Christian, you said earlier it's not like 1999 anymore. So how radically different have
That's right. I think many of the technologies that were around back then were just unproven. And I think we're now finally seeing the fruits of those technologies. For example, gene therapy is starting to actually really work and seeing some real traction in some of our clients like Avalanche with the gene therapy in the eye, seeing real efficacy. RNAi is another example of a technology that has been around for quite a while that is now starting to become late stage in the clinic, and we're seeing some really strong efficacy. So I think there are a number of those technologies out there, and I think we're excited to see what's going to come of them in the next 5 or 10 years when they start generating approved products.
Great, thanks. So as we talk about deal mechanics, Christian, I'll ask you to comment first. 2015 started off with a bang with Shire's purchase of NPS. Do you think we'll see a steady stream of M&A activity this year?
So I do. I think compared to last year, I don't think a lot has changed except for stock price appreciation. So there are a number of factors I think that contributed to this phenomenon. I think number one is companies that are making these acquisitions are largely being rewarded in the form of stock price appreciation. You can see that with Valiant, Activists, and a few of the others that have been serial acquirers of companies, and especially larger companies. The debt environment is very good. Cost of debt is low. And many pharma companies have strong balance sheets today. So I think there are a number of factors that are driving this.
Thanks. Large companies like Pfizer have been on the acquisition trail. Do you expect 2015 to be a year of mega-mergers? Adam?
For the funds that we manage, we don't tend to focus on mega-mergers per se. I think you will continue to see several strategic moves, partnerships, maybe some of the things we'll talk about today. And I think you will see a few of those mega-merger types. Specifically with Pfizer, things that we think about is what are the dominoes that start to fall when those mergers happen, whether it be in the supply chain, so to speak, it could be in the development stage, it could be in the commercial stage. In a recent investment we made in a company called Softbox in the cold chain packaging space, literally in one of the customer calls we made, the conversation of Pfizerizing the supply chain came up, which is how do they continue to harness and streamline their supply chain to create the efficiencies that hopefully it's not only to capitalize on the innovation, but frankly then to make the margin and the return on such transactions.
And Christian, what do you expect to see in mega-mergers this year?
So again, I think it depends on the definition of a mega merger and the size. I think that the large mergers of equals like we saw back in 2009 with some of the deals that Merck did, et cetera, I think we're less likely to see some of those, but these pharma cyclic types of deals where they're $20 billion deals, some people would call those mega mergers. I think we will continue to see those. There are a number of targets out there that, a number of companies have looked at and a number of banks such as ourselves have talked about on the other side of the table. And, we would anticipate seeing a few more of those in 2015.
Thanks. And Darren?
You can go back 20 or even 30 years and see waves of consolidation in the pharmaceutical industry. So it's not that unusual, right, to see it. Mega mergers by themselves, however, we look at from time to time. I think everyone in the large pharma sector looks at them. Our point of view has been that they really tend to stultify innovation. They kind of paralyze the actual innovators, right? So if you're a scientist running a lab in one of these target companies and you find yourself in the middle of a big mega merger, you tend to kind of hunker down a little bit. So our view is that they actually tend to depress levels of innovation. What we get paid for is innovation. And so our focus has been that so long as those kind of mergers focus on things where the industrial logic is really not pro-innovation, we tend to think that they tend to be fairly short-lived, and things that in general we can't figure out industrial logic to support them.
Great, thanks. And Darren, I'll stick with you for the next question. How's the Affordable Care Act still affecting pharmaceutical makers?
Well, there the industrial logic, to follow on with that last comment, is certainly good, and we support it, and very much so in the respect that it enhances access to medicines, right? So our view is that anything that enhances the access of patients to novel medicines that can really improve their lives, we think is a positive. To date, I have to tell you, I think that we, like most companies, are in the process of paying the fees associated with the Affordable Care Act, but we're not really seeing yet the bottom line impact because we haven't seen really significant revenue formation yet from it. So it's still early days, and I guess we'll have to wait to see.
Thanks. Have any macroeconomic trends specifically impacted pharma M&A? And Adam, I'll ask you to comment first, please.
I would say even more broadly than just pharma M&A, clearly very strong macroeconomic trends, whether it be the financing markets, whether it be some of the valuations in equity markets, some of those underlying positives that we see. That does drive the ability for strategics to have access to capital, cheaper capital. It also allows people that are in Christian's position as well to speak to firms like mine, or maybe even that manage some more capital larger than we do, to talk about playing in particular M&A transactions that they historically may not have been able to be competitive on, given that access to capital, which allows maybe some valuation uptick, which we're all loath to pay, but nonetheless we need to get capital deployed in high quality assets.
Thanks, Darren.
Mm-hmm. I think further to Adam and Christian's point, I think the strength of balance sheets across the sector, at least for the large cap pharma companies, continues to be terrific, really. I do think the cost of capital is a very positive thing. I guess it depends on the extent to which companies are willing to put additional leverage into their balance sheet. And there's going to be an upper limit that's different probably for every single company. But those larger trends, I think, are making certain kinds of acquisitions probably at least marginally more attractive But again, it kind of comes down to the question of, is this something that really adds to innovation? Is there something where the industrial logic underlies it? In which case, the sort of meta factors that you see, the larger economic trends, are supportive of it. All right? Well, I don't know that we would do it necessarily just for that reason. In fact, I doubt we would.
Thanks. What are your thoughts on pharmaceutical M&A versus other subsectors such as medical devices, services, and healthcare IT? And Christian, I'll ask you to take that one first, please.
Sure. So I think the one big difference, and I know we're going to get to this question later, is the role of private equity in some of these other subsectors. We don't see a large role of private equity in the pharma space. There are dedicated funds that tend to focus there. But if you look at these other sectors, such as healthcare ITs, healthcare services, you open up the universe to another 100, 200 different funds, such as Adam's Fund, that participate regularly. So historically, the pharma space on the M&A side has been really a strategic universe of buyers. So it's much more limited, and therefore can be more challenging to end up in a transaction. So I think in the other sectors, there's probably more deal activity. There's smaller deals. But if you look at the number of transactions, some of these other sectors are very, very robust.
Great, thanks. And Adam?
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that commentary. For us as a fund, we focus on pharmaceutical supply chain or infrastructure, what we're going to talk extensively about here today, med tech, med devices, healthcare IT, and tech-enabled services. And then as we think about the provider services landscape, it's really kind of alternate site care and hospital outsourcing. In those other sectors, especially the provider landscape, there is an incredibly fragmented marketplace in almost every sector. It could be physical therapy, it could be hospice, it could be home care. You go down the chain of discrete verticals, incredible fragmentation. There needs to be consolidation. If you look at some of the things that the Affordable Care Act is going to try to force and implement, bundled care, bundled payments against larger and larger payers, right? Why did the payers win the battle over the previous 14 to 20 years? It was because they consolidated, they got scale faster than the provider landscape. So you're going to see that wave starting to happen, whether it be hospitals buying up physician groups or physicians finally aligning in a more appropriate manner than the original physician practice management companies from 20 years ago. If you think about technology, healthcare IT, and tech-enabled services, it could be almost any company in the landscape. It is the bigger companies in that space have been acquisitive. You could take a company like Allscripts, and it was Mysis or DB Motion, other things they've added to their franchise in order to create a more holistic solution for their customer base. These are things that not only will the strategics be competitive in, but sponsors like ourselves, we find these incredibly fertile areas to invest in.
Great, thanks. Pharma companies also often enter into collaborations or partnerships. Will these types of agreements pick up in 2015 as opposed to mergers and acquisitions? Darren?
We've seen them be actually very strong for at least the last 4 or 5 years, especially between two different large cap pharma companies. So for example, over the last 5 years, we've done 3 very large collaborations with some of our biggest competitors, actually. So we started in the diabetes space with a multi-molecule collaboration with Boehringer Ingelheim back in 2010. A little bit after that, we did a collaboration with Pfizer in the area of pain, and more recently with AstraZeneca and Alzheimer's disease. What you see in all of those 3 areas, sort of the common thread, if you will, or common threads are, number one, some specific expertise maybe that we had that we could bring to bear on it. So maybe it's the expertise of developing Alzheimer's drugs because we've expended probably more capital on that than maybe anyone, actually. Or maybe it's the the commercialization engine that we can bring to bear, for example, in the diabetes space. So there are usually some very specific kinds of capabilities that large cap pharma partners are looking for to collaborate with each other. While those are complex and they're hard to manage, and quite frankly, probably not every large cap pharma company wants to or really could do those, they really are great ways to allocate the risk of very large programs. For some of the smaller companies, there again, the primary issue is, does the company want to stay independent for as long as possible? Does it want to maybe get itself to a higher valuation inflection point if it's looking ultimately to IPO or to sell itself on a trade sale? And there, those collaborations can help bring in not only some needed capital, but also some needed expertise and capacity. And the final area that we see them in, and less often, but they can be fairly interesting areas, and Adam has worked in some of these areas as well, but you look at some of the supply chain kinds of collaborations you can have. Some years back, we did a deal with Covance, which is one of our major suppliers, where we actually sort of cleaved off all of the tox research and ADME work that's being done at Lilly, or most of it, I should say, and actually the entire site, the physical site where all that was done, and did a deal with Covance where they took over all that work. And so a site that was for, I don't know, maybe 60 or 70 years, a Lilly-only site is now owned by Covance, and they're actually doing work. What used to be former Lilly employees are now doing work for most of our competitors, actually, as well as for Lilly.
Christian, what do you expect to see out of collaborations?
So I think it's a complex series of questions that you'd have to go through, and depending on, if it's a private company or a public company, and I'll speak from more the smaller company side. So if it's a private company, the question is, with today's financing markets, how will a partnership affect my ability to do an IPO? And how will investors perceive a large pharma partner? And, by the way, who is that partner? So that's a question that we often get is, if I partner my lead asset, am I a good public company story? So we get that quite often. Now, it oftentimes makes sense if it's an earlier stage asset, they need some validation, as Darren had mentioned, that a big pharma partner can bring. And therefore, when they do an IPO, it can elevate the stature of the deal and the valuation. On the flip side, with the M&A discussion, again, it comes back to the capital markets. Is there a financing window available to me? If it's a one-product company, clearly you don't want to partner. It's more of an M&A discussion. And part of this just depends on stage. So, many pharma companies, they're pretty interested in very early stage assets like preclinical or very late stage assets. And, in general, the earlier stage the asset is, the more likely it is to be partnered versus acquired.
I would say for us as a sponsor, partnerships, especially with strategics, are incredibly compelling. Especially as we focus on lower middle market businesses, it's a way to more rapidly commercialize that company, almost across any sector. Could be a service, could be technology, could be pharma infrastructure. And then secondly, it also validates your investment thesis. If you can get that investor to come in at the same time you're making the investment rather than down the road. And I think we have, as a firm, been very successful in doing that. I think about, there's a little bit of a triangular relationship here with Darren even prior to today. Eli Lilly was partnered with Covance when we were invested in a company called Caprion Proteomics, which is the leading proteomic biomarker discovery company in the world. At the time, it was a small business, and we had a relationship with Covance. We brought them in as a strategic investor. It allowed not only a more sophisticated sales call to the client base, since those client bases were effectively the same, but also it allowed us to have access to their 110-person kind of central lab function in Covance. What was embedded inside Covance while it's a CRO is this enormous lab operation and capability, which helped sophisticate Caprion even further. I think about recently, we brought in Allscripts as an investor in our company Citra Health Solutions, which is an ACO enablement population health business. And if the rumors around Evolent and its valuation are at all true, then we're going to make a lot of money here. But Allscripts, if you think about its relationship with 180,000 ambulatory physician offices across the country, it's a great distribution channel. And then we can help empower their DB Motion product, which is their population health repository, and then we can be the service backend for that. And we've done that similarly. WebMD was an investor in Connexure. Summa Health on the services side, on our radiology business, is an investor along with us in Eris. It's incredibly compelling, and frankly, very compelling not only to us, our investors, but to the management teams that we're trying to convince that we will be value-added partners for.
Great, thanks. Do you think we'll see private equity take an interest in pharmaceuticals, Christian?
So again, to differentiate private equity from the other sources of capital, private equity in my world is buyout firms that use debt to help finance acquisitions. Therefore, many of them have to be cash flow positive. So that's a challenge in the pharma space. There are 4 or 5 funds that do this a lot, and they do this very well. Of the number of others that are out there, many have looked to do that, and maybe Adam can comment later about why they haven't jumped in to do these transactions. But from my perspective, a lot of it comes down to valuation and just access to the assets. So many of these assets do come from larger pharma, and if you're not aware of where these assets sit or have some foray into them or relationships with the big pharma, it's going to be a challenge for you to pull those assets out at a reasonable valuation that can make the economics work for the private equity firm.
And Adam, as our private equity guy, what are your thoughts?
Sure. No, I think Christian's 100% right here. I think there are firms out there, and to credit them, GTCR, Cerberus, Oryx has a platform in similar space. You can do it and replicate it if you're going to compete for an asset coming out of pharma on that valuation point Christian's talking about, which is difficult. Having embedded infrastructure, having a sales force, manufacturing capability, and most importantly, a management team who has organized this and done this before is incredibly important to get conviction inside of our walls, a firm like us, to make an investment. And I think if you don't have one of those, it's incredibly compelling to kind of jump in, especially where we're talking a lot about valuation. Where valuations sit today, no matter what financing rates are, no matter what leverage levels look like, buying a business at some of the valuations being discussed today on a kind of de novo basis, very difficult.
Great, thanks. With the rise in biosimilars, are there any drugs or companies that are at risk of falling out of favor? Darren?
The answer to that question, Mark, really falls on the question of just how exposed is any given company to any large molecule, right? Because the biosimilars really are the, if you will, the generic version, so to speak, of large molecules, antibodies, peptides, and the like. For the most part, the companies that have had these kinds of molecules have not really been exposed to the kind of decay of the sales curve that you see with small molecules, right? So, for example, when Lilly lost the patent on Cymbalta and depression, or Zyprexa and schizophrenia, we saw our sales fall away fairly rapidly, right? That sales decay curve came very, very quickly. And in fact, in general, what you're seeing is for small molecules, those sales decay curves are happening faster and faster. What we're seeing is a greater interest, certainly on the side of the payers in the industry now, and trying to find ways to introduce biosimilars wherever possible as a substitute for some of the brand name proprietary products in the large molecule space. And so the companies that are going to have the greatest exposure to that are the ones where the greatest exposure of their top line is related to one or two key large molecules. For the rest of us, I think relatively few of the large pharma companies anyway have gone whole hog, if you will, into biosimilars. Most of us have done it on a much more kind of ad hoc basis. So for example, we're developing a biosimilar in the diabetes space that is designed to really just help fill out our franchise, right, to give us an additional offering. Many of us really are very much focused, as we are at Lilly, on innovation, and so biosimilars help to fill that out, but because they're a follow-on to something that's innovative, they're not really innovative themselves. They really are just offering what will likely be a lower price version of something that's currently available. So it'll ultimately be good for patients by offering them more choices, by helping to lower the cost of medicines for patients. That's, long term, that's a good thing. That's actually pro-innovation. That's not negative for innovation. Because what it does is it forces all of us who are in the innovation business to stay on our A game and continue to invest in innovation in large molecules, small molecules across the board.
Great, thanks. Venture capital has played a critical role in financing life sciences. How do you see venture capital impacting the industry this year? Adam?
I might even think, over a longer window than just this year. I think venture capital as an asset class in the life sciences space has been a difficult one. If you look at a set of returns over a very long window, 30 years, the asset class itself is negative. Now, clearly there are success stories on discrete assets, one-off, but I do think it's a fundamental question for how does capital formation happen around new and exciting novel therapeutics or molecules, and then generate a successful return for not only the innovators, but then the investors. So we'll clearly see those ideas. They tend to be a little bit more mature before they get a lot of capital behind them. So I think it's going to be a challenge for some of those younger, more novel, nascent stage assets.
Christian, what are your thoughts on venture capital?
I think they'll have make a large impact in companies moving forward. I think many of the VCs they didn't raise new funds after the financial downturn. So what you have today are some larger venture capital funds that are stronger. They have better operators, and I think that will help ultimately the companies that they form. And it's just a requirement for biotechnology. These are early stage technologies often. They require a tremendous amount of capital, and it's really the only source of capital available to them, with the exception of the public markets. And sometimes you do see reverse mergers or very early stage IPOs that get public. But to use traditional sources of capital, such as private equity or family offices or just wealthy individuals. It's just it's a huge challenge when you require 20, 30, 40, $50 million to get to an inflection point.
If I could, some of the things that are happening in the supply chain that will hopefully exacerbate the challenges Christian and I are talking about, and I'm sure Darren would share, which is the critical pathway initiative, more targeted therapeutics, more personalized medicine, all these things we talked about up front, this new scientific capability. A dozen years ago, it was $100 million to sequence one genome. Today, it's less than $1,000. These are things with smaller patient populations, businesses like Caprion, again, that can help either streamline an approval process or, frankly, knock a drug out earlier in its development cycle, so you have only spent $10 million, $20 million, versus getting to the point you've spent $700 million and failing in a phase 3 trial. Those are the ways that the drug development cycle will help venture stage businesses get financed more easily.
Great, thanks. Will we see more deals related to specific assets as opposed to whole companies, Christian?
So I do think many of the companies that are targets for large pharma, they really are single asset companies that are far along or approved. We saw that with Pharmacyclics in the AbbVie transaction. It was largely a one product deal. So I would just differentiate that versus a larger platform company that's vertically integrated with many products, and there are many of them out there, such as a Shire, et cetera. So I do think, Darren had mentioned earlier that it's these larger companies that require real integration. Those are challenging transactions to get done for a number of reasons. And these smaller companies that they may have very large valuations, but they're more or less one asset deals. Those tend to be much easier to get done and just make a lot more sense in the long run.
Thanks, Darren.
Every once in a while we do buy a company that we're buying more than just the molecule. So for example, Imclone is a great example of that, where we got access to a marketed compound, Erbitux, but then a pipeline of other molecules, and then key capabilities. So here in New York City, where we're taping this, Lilly actually has our oncology discovery group, which is based here in New York City, and it really is an outgrowth of what we got with Imclone. But to Christian's point earlier, I think most of the acquisitions that we'll look for are really based on specific molecules, and then trying to figure out how can we get greater efficiency around those. So you see in a lot of the deals where the company gets bought, and you're going to try to drive synergy around that, which really means cutting back on everything other than molecule-related costs. Over the last 5 years or so, we've begun experimenting with a couple of venture capital fund managers, TVM, which is based in Munich and Montreal, and Healthcare Ventures, which is based in Cambridge, Mass, as well as Atlas Ventures. And what we've done with them is actually focus on an asset-specific, or what we call sometimes a project-focused company, where the entire company is based really just on a single molecule. And we've tried to build a much more capital-efficient approach to developing these molecules. So here we're really not trying to put money into building company, if you will. Mm-hmm. So we're not using the investment capital to go get a lab space or rent office space or hire any number of additional people who will only be there for the period of time in which the company is sort of getting itself ready to be sold. Rather, what we're doing is we're combining capabilities within the venture capital firm, the independent judgment and driving molecules through, together with capacity and capabilities at Lilly. So we, for example, have a group that we call Chorus, which is a development engine that drives molecules, single molecules, from the clinical candidate stage, so about a year away from going into the candidate, through phase 2A proof of concept. And at the end of that, we'll have a data package that basically tells us whether we really think we got a molecule there. Is there really a medicine there, I should say. That model was really designed around individual molecules, whether they come from the Lilly pipeline. So this arrangement that we have actually gives them access to molecules that essentially become surplus to us, if you will. We've developed too many molecules at a given point in time. We'd like to see more of them proceed, but we can't justify putting more money into that stage of development. Sometimes they're the second or third or fourth molecule. Christian, I think earlier, raised the point that many of the venture-backed companies will really focus their greatest energies and attention on their lead molecule. Well, sometimes they'll have a second or third molecule or a fourth molecule that isn't getting as much attention. Those kinds of molecules as well become the kind of substrate that a fund like this actually can work on. And what we're seeing is, it's early days, but we've now got about 14 companies we've been able to drive these, together with the fund managers, we've been able to drive these molecules to completion in about 3 years, get all this work done for about $10 million on average. And that is much faster and much cheaper than the industry average, but we're doing it in combination with them to create data packages that actually meet our standards. Right? One of the big issues that a lot of big buyers have is the quality of the data package that comes along with a molecule. Right? Does it meet the standards of a company that's ultimately going to have to actually sell medicines? Right? So you could say we're in the business, if you will, of selling medicines, and others in the business of selling companies. We're all part of the same ecosystem, right? One isn't better than the other. We depend on each other, okay? But for someone who's in the business of selling medicines, the data package is absolutely unsurpassed in importance, right? So this kind of more novel approach, it's a kind of a hybrid approach to what we're seeing now in some of the venture capital funds. It's not for everyone, we know that. But it is attracting some real attention. We got the first of the molecules to come out. Lilly actually bought last year the first of the molecules to come through that. It was actually a molecule that started its life in Lilly's laboratories. It was funded by Atlas Venture and OrbiMed. The work was done at their direction by the Chorus Development Unit, and then Lilly bought the molecule back, and we're looking to put it into phase 3 here, hopefully pretty soon. So we're seeing innovation in some of the models to try to focus in on some hyper-efficient approaches to specific molecule development. It's not the be-all and end-all for everything, but it is one additional tool in the toolbox.
Thanks. And Adam, what do you expect to see in terms of single asset deals?
I think I would go back to the company. The single asset deal from a private equity fund, it's got to be pretty mature for it to be something that we could capitalize. And then I think we're in that conversation about valuation and whether or not we could get there if we didn't have an existing platform. So I think it would be challenged.
Thanks. What kind of impact does venture capital have on the pharma industry, especially in terms of their financing? Christian?
Yeah, so I think, as Darren mentioned, there's a very close connection between venture capital and pharma. And I think in part it's because historically, at least over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been more innovation probably coming out of the smaller biotechs that the VCs are associated with. And obviously, large pharma wants access to that. So, and from the venture capitalist perspective, it's a way to de-risk early and to finance some of these early stage opportunities. So I do think we're going to continue to see more of this as we move forward. And it's a very good business model for both sides. And I think it's also very easy for the large pharma to go to a select few venture capitalists to understand the entire landscape and their portfolio versus just the logistics and challenges of having to reach out to every individual company that's in somebody else's portfolio. So you do see a very, very close collaboration between the two.
Can I add one additional
Please,
point? We did analysis, and others have done similar analysis, looking back at the number of new molecular entities, so really new novel medicines, that were approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration going back over a 5 and 6 year period. So long enough so that we could see some real trends in there. And by the way, that's been, as several of us have noted in an earlier conversation before we started taping this, it's been a period actually of real productivity for the FDA, right? So there have been a lot of new molecules that have been approved over that period. What we saw is that over 70% of those molecules are being sponsored by a company other than the innovator, right? So in other words, what we're seeing is aggregation of innovation, and venture capital played a really key role in over 50% of those molecules that made their way through. So I don't think any of us would want to understate the importance of venture capital, but it's also got to be a healthy ecosystem for them where the right number of firms are putting the right kinds of investments in the ground. There isn't too much money, because we've seen sometimes probably where maybe there's a little bit too much money chasing too few good quality opportunities.
Great, thanks. Are consolidators in the space watching IPOs to decide what companies to buy? With strong openings such as that of Spark Therapeutics recently and continued strong performance, could a strong IPO mean that they're a more likely takeout candidate? Adam?
I would comment, whether it be Spark, Kite, Juno, these are all, going back to the first commentary, very exciting technologies, very exciting companies. They are nonetheless largely phase 1 stage assets with several unanswered questions, leaving people to scratch their heads about valuation, comments of bubble, et cetera. So whether they're a takeout candidate or whether they're just going to need incremental financing, whether it be a secondary or frankly where our hedge fund, our vehicle that focuses on public companies, has had a very long and successful track record. There are companies out there with great technologies. For whatever reason, they hit a hiccup. It could be the phase 1 data, it could be going from phase 2 to phase 3, and they've got to modify the trial design, and it's going to require more capital. Our hedge fund over time, whether it be Amarin, Panicos, AMAG, et cetera, very successful track record of getting those companies through that little valley and window. So I do think, again, some of these technologies, some of these companies will need future capital, and it's a question of whether it's partnered with Lilly, whether it's a Great Point Partners investment, whether it's a larger secondary offering, or it's just through consolidation. There's going to be a wave of those, and it'd be hard to predict which ones they are today, but I would say it's almost a fait accompli that will happen.
Christian, what are your thoughts?
So I would say in the past, our discussions were more around M&A, especially with a private company, and then it switched to more of a dual track discussion where you would push M&A, but you would fall back on the IPO. And today, more and more, we're hearing only the IPO discussion, because our clients are saying, well, why would I sell for a small amount up front in a structured transaction with multiple earnouts versus going public? And as Adam mentioned, the very large valuations we're seeing with some early stage companies. So I think there's a negative correlation. I think, in a hot IPO market, you're seeing fewer M&A transactions, especially at these earlier stage companies. And it's just a challenge for a pharma company to, I think, make a bet on an early stage asset, unless, it tends to be an oncology asset where it's a proven target class. And, this is the next best thing out there, and they know they want to be in that class. Then you see transactions. But for, platform technologies, it's very tough for me to see paying public market valuations for these early stage companies, unless it's a much later stage asset. Again, if it's a single asset company, there are companies out there like Auspex, which are essentially a one asset company that have phase 3 data that could fit nicely into a CNS portfolio. Those are the types of, I think, companies that you could see being acquired, earlier in their public company life.
Dan, what do you see?
Well, I think if and I think to take Christian's point, for the companies that have one asset or maybe two assets at most, the risk is maybe a little bit easier to understand than for a platform company, maybe. But will you see a lot of M&A prior to the point where you see technical risk get discharged, big technical risk? That's probably harder. You haven't seen that much of that kind of activity, because it ends up being sort of one data card flipping over, right? And if that data card flips over and you've made a big acquisition and it turns out to be negative, then you've got a pretty significant impairment. You've got to determine what it is that you can do, if anything, with that asset. And so for the kinds of valuations that we're seeing, as Christian said, for assets where the technical risk really hasn't been discharged, that's probably a lot harder to do. Not impossible. Where you do see some deals being done, again, not many, are where some companies are taking a point of view prior to discharging a big regulatory risk. So sometimes you'll see someone who thinks that they maybe have a unique point of view on maybe an IP-related risk or another regulatory risk, maybe with the FDA of approval. They may be willing to take that kind of risk in advance, but that doesn't always work out. And Merck, as you saw, did the Cubist acquisition not long ago. They did so, I'm quite positive, knowing exactly the nature of the kind of IP-related risk with their lead molecule. But of course, you never really know when that risk is going to get discharged. You never know exactly how. So it just ends up being the kind of risk you have to be prepared to take, and it sometimes has a bit of a binary quality to it. So it's a little bit harder, I think, for many of us to figure out whether or not that makes sense relative to the other things that we have to invest in, right? So the other thing to keep in mind here is all of these investments end up being investments relative to the other options that we have, right? So if we were investing at a time when our own pipelines were dry, when our own innovation engines really weren't producing very much, and there have been those periods in the history of the industry. And if you've been around the industry, I guess as long as I have, you've gotten a chance to see some of those. But if you're investing at that time, it's a very different choice than when as we are, for example, right now, we're actually making choices between some of the very interesting external opportunities and interesting internal opportunities. And we're forcing very specific kinds of trade-off choices, right? So when we go outside to go after something, we're usually giving up something internal that is very interesting, but maybe not quite as interesting. And so those are the kind of choices that many of us are faced with, and those binary kinds of decisions aren't aren't maybe as attractive if you've got other good opportunities to put shareholder capital into.
Great, thanks. Many companies have IPO'd in the last couple of years due to favorable markets. Could some of these companies now become targets for big companies? Adam?
I think going back to what we talked about when we were talking about Kite, Juno, Spark, et cetera, it really is a question of that technological risk, that regulatory risk, how do they fare, and then what access to capital do they need, and whether or not they do fit into somebody else's product estate, or it's just going to be a question for continued financing in an open market.
Great. Kristen, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think there are a number of recent companies that are one-product companies. They're very far along. ZS Pharma, Relipsa, they're both in the same product class, but they're one-product companies, and they have phase 3 data. Auspex, as I mentioned earlier, another phase 3 company with essentially one product. And there are a few others out there that have IPO'd over the last 24 months that could certainly be targets for large pharma.
Darren?
What we've seen is in the IPO market, for the companies that have been able to do well, meaning generate positive data and continue to show that they're an attractive investment, the follow-on financing market has been very good for them. So I know some of those companies have at least expressed an interest in seeing whether or not there's a way for them to maintain independent existence and maybe even build themselves up into a larger company, a la Gilead or a la Celgene, et cetera. And that's always possible. Part of the question comes down to is the company working in an area where the additional investments that are necessary to fully develop the medicine? So is there a whole suite of indications that are going to require more and more and more investment? Can you buy those capabilities in an open market? Can you just go out and get not just cash from the public market, but can you buy the capabilities that are necessary? Some of these capabilities you can just sort of buy by the drink, if you will. Others, really, you've got to get entire engines available, right? So, for example, in the diabetes space, it's not just the expense of doing a large phase 3 with thousands, maybe even over 10,000 patients in some cases, but also the kind of commercial engine that is required to take it to the market. Versus the oncology area, where you're seeing the ability to actually get to the market in certain highly specialized tumor types with a relatively small sales force, where you might be able to pull that off on your own.
Great, thanks. We spoke earlier about some of the challenges of attracting PE investment, but Adam, are there any thoughts on particular subsectors that would be attractive to private equity?
You're asking me to tell the world what my best investment idea is?
If you don't mind, please.
Okay.
Your second best, or third best.
Second or third? Okay, I'm happy to give those out. What I would say, we tend not to focus on the single asset itself, the product itself, but we are looking through the supply chain. And so where areas we have found a lot of success, especially as a lower middle market investor, some of that infrastructure purchasing a la carte, as Darren was talking about, such as with Cytovance, our complex protein manufacturer, not something that biotech, biopharma companies can build up that capability, buy stirred bioreactors and fermenters, et cetera, which cost millions and millions of dollars. They need to spend their venture capital raised dollars in other places to advance the trial. Very successful, idea for us, and Darren Head there has done a great job building that company. Caprion we talked about earlier. So where we start to focus on that supply chain, especially in the commercialization, you think we're being a bit of an arms dealer in the arms race to multiple companies. Those are where some of our most fertile ideas do stem.
And Christian, your thoughts on sectors that be attractive, subsectors be attractive to private equity?
So again, I think it's cash flowing businesses are number one. Healthcare IT, we've seen, we have a large team within our bank. We've seen a tremendous amount of interest in that sector. Again, it's extremely fragmented. There just aren't the large consolidators out there. Healthcare services has always been a great business for us. You can start a business with not a lot of capital, and you just need to piece together the right assets and the right people and the right ideas, and you can do that. So I would assume that those would continue to move on very strongly in 2015.
Great. As we look at drug types, will orphan drugs, cancer drugs, or any other types of drugs be the most attractive? Christian?
So oncology there's a tremendous amount of interest out there. And again, it's a bit of a target of the day. So, in the last 12 months or last 24 months, they've been checkpoint inhibitors and the related molecules. That's sort of moved on to CAR T and now off-the-shelf CAR T. Those have been big areas of interest. And I would also say antibiotics and just anti-infectives in general. So antivirals is another big area where we would expect to see a tremendous amount of interest following from Hep C going now to hepatitis B.
Great. Adam, your thoughts on that one?
I think those are all great ideas, and I think while we may not as a fund target those things, I do think the categories like orphan drugs are incredibly exciting, incredibly necessary. Small patient populations, less than 200,000 patients per year in the United States, kind of as the classical definition. Companies like Alexion, which owns Soliris, that's a $2 billion drug. So we think about it as, an orphan, but that's actually a very large drug category. It does something, removes blood removes the need for blood transfusions for specific patient populations. It basically, the antibody returns the body to normal function. You think about Kalydeco around cystic fibrosis. Similar, these are things in patient populations, longer life, better life, no alternative therapies. I think they're incredibly interesting asset categories.
Okay, thanks. Darren?
Adam mentioned earlier that the science is really pointing us in some very interesting directions now. And so when we look at the advances in cellular and molecular biology, as well as some of the advances that have come out of the Human Genome Project, what we're seeing is some of the new targets for disease, whether it's in oncology or in immunology, for example. Those are two areas in particular where we're seeing some very interesting opportunities to invest. We see that there's an opportunity as well to have some companion diagnostics or good biomarkers in any event that actually enable us to discharge risk at an earlier stage so that we're not making very large phase 3 investments prior to the point where we know more about the opportunity. That is something that is actually very interesting to us. In each of these cases, in oncology and immunology, you can have a pipeline and a molecule. And so from the perspective of a large pharmaceutical company that's looking to try to be able to make the most out of a medicine and make it available to as many of the different patients who could benefit from it as possible, that pipeline and molecule concept is something that's actually extremely attractive to us. And then for each of those, there are some other very interesting opportunities that become available because of greater certainty now around the regulatory endpoints. I think there's been a great deal of progress in the area of trying to understand what kind of regulatory endpoints would be acceptable for the major regulators, the FDA, EMEA, and others, that would make a development stage compound something that we should invest in, either on our own pipeline or outside. We actually don't make a distinction between those two. The other area that I guess Lilly ends up being a bit of an outlier in, but we think is actually really important for society, is neurodegeneration. So that's an area where we've seen in protein misfolding diseases, broadly speaking, we're seeing some new insights that we're very hopeful will lead to some new therapies. First and foremost in Alzheimer's disease, as I mentioned earlier, we've probably invested more than just about anybody in the area, and at least in the large cap pharma companies, in the area of Alzheimer's disease. It's a very important thing for society that we find some solutions there, whether it's Lilly or one of our competitors. And there will be multiple solutions there, we hope and we believe. But that's an area where, as Christian pointed out earlier, these diseases of aging, right? As we get older, we see certain chronic illnesses that are the companions of aging, whether it be cardiovascular disease or diabetes or neurodegeneration. We're seeing that as well. That's an area that has not attracted a huge amount of outside capital, but we're hopeful actually that we'll start to see more there as some new insights are being yielded in protein misfolding.
Great, thanks. Do you think biosimilars may be attracted to pharma companies as they were to Pfizer earlier this year? Christian?
I do, and we've worked on a number of transactions in the space, and I'll tell you that the recent first biosimilar approval by Sandoz just a week or so ago, I think will make parties even more interested. Certainly investors are much more interested today because of that. But I would say there are three categories of pharma companies. Number one are the people that are just, they're bought into it, and it was Hospira, it's Pfizer, and Amgen. They knew years ago that they wanted to be in it. You have another group of companies who they entered into strategic relationships because they thought it would be important, and then they've either backed out of those or they've minimized those. And then you have, I would say, almost all the rest who are in it selectively or they have selective interest. And Darren, you mentioned Lilly is in the space. It's not a distinct strategy, but you have products, and I would say that's the case for most of the pharma companies out there. So I do think you're going to continue to see it. The question is, where are the assets out there? On the public side, there are probably 2 or 3 pure plays out there now that are only doing biosimilars. Phoenix is a client of mine, and they were one of the first to go public in the space. There's a tremendous amount of interest there. They recently did a partnership with Pfizer via Hospira. And then you have Coherus out there, which was another recent one. So the question is, how will you access that space in the U.S., given all the other partnerships that are out there?
Adam, what do you think we'll see?
I think that you'll see not only the things Christian's talking about, but then what are the reverberations, whether they're intended or unintended consequences throughout the ecosystem here. And it's a thesis and theme that we've underwritten several times as a fund and a firm. This rise in large molecule, first from the branded side and now from the biosimilar side. Today, 40% of pharmaceutical products sold is large molecule or specialty in nature. If you look at the clinical stage assets today, that's 60 to 70% of pipeline. And then you put a dollar weighting on it, right? We're talking about 80 to 90% of ultimate total dollar spend in the United States. And so as you think about what are those next steps, what are the derivative ideas and opportunities? It's complex protein manufacturing. So our Cytovance company, which I mentioned before, a business we owned previously called MediaTek, which is now owned by Corning, which makes cell culture media. You cannot chemically create or synthetically replicate large molecules. They need to be growing on a cell culture line, whether it be bacterial or mammalian. And you need media to do that. All of these themes, and you look at Corona, a business we invested in about a year ago right now, with biosimilars, the need for pharmacovigilance and post-approval monitoring are going to be core and critical. So Corona is built around patient registries, originally around RA, but we're going to move into other autoimmune disorder diseases in order to track such data and make it available for pharma and clients, et cetera. So those are the things I think that as you think about what are the next moves on the chessboard, which would be incredibly interesting and compelling.
Darren?
Well, first, I was happy to hear Christian mention Coherus. Actually, that was a Lilly Ventures portfolio company, so I'm sure he knows that. But we actually made that investment in part to be able to kind of have a ringside seat to just see, at least from one point of view, from the Coherus management team's point of view, how that was going to start to play itself out. And was that an area where we should get in more broadly? What we realized that was for us, that probably didn't make sense as a company at Lilly. And so we do fall into that third category, as Christian described, where selectively we will go into it, either as a way to fill out some of our offerings in a region. So maybe there are certain regional markets where a biosimilar would actually be a nice thing to be able to tuck into some of our sales offerings. Or more broadly on a global basis, we would look at biosimilars as a way to flesh out a broader set of franchise offerings. So for example, in the diabetes space, that's exactly how we're doing it. The thing to keep in mind, though, is you still have, in general, you still have expensive products to sell that tends to impact margins. You're going into a space where prices, by definition, are going to be lower. The biosimilars are going to create more price competition there because they're really not offering anything novel per se. And so that's going to provide more and more margin pressure, I think, on a lot of companies. And so you have to consider that into the mix of all the kinds of investment opportunities that you have, just how broadly you want to go into that kind of opportunity, and also how well it fits with the broader strategy that you have. If you have a sort of pure play innovation strategy, biosimilars have some role, but probably a pretty limited one. If you have a strategy where innovation is one of several, if you will, legs of the stool, then it may be something that is a much more robust kind of product offering for you within that kind of a company.
Great. What about companies that support the biosimilar market through transportation, clinical testing, or storage? Are these companies interesting to pharma companies? Adam?
I'd say absolutely, and I won't go back through kind of some of the things just chatted about, but the demands on whether it be branded biologic or it be a biosimilar, this ecosystem, there are today 3 times the number of profitable biotechnology companies than there were a decade ago. Companies of the larger scale, the Lonzas, the Catalents of the world, cannot service the vast number of companies that are out there. So whether it be cold chain packaging in our company Softbox, whether it be transportation and other logistics, it could be future development, it could be sales and marketing, those types of things, all need to be supported more greatly than they are today. So I think they're incredibly interesting areas to focus on.
Christian?
Yeah, I agree. And I think from an M&A perspective, pharma buying those, it's probably less the case. We often, our colleagues in healthcare services and healthcare IT, they oftentimes want us to call a pharma company on their behalf to see if there's an interest in actually acquiring. But the question to the pharma company is, do I want to own it or can I rent it? And I think the answer is almost always, I'm perfectly happy to rent that technology or that service.
But some of the things, and interesting transactions that your firm and franchise have worked on that touch some of the businesses we're invested in, and incredibly compelling and successful outcomes. It may not be the pharma companies themselves that want to own them, but it's other people that are surrounding pharma with services and products that really find those compelling and are paying, obviously great valuations even in today's marketplace. They're clearing valuations that are even better than maybe the IPO market, et cetera.
One of the things that, if I can jump in, one of the things that starts to become more important here is what is the ultimate customer experience, the patient experience. It's usually the patient. I mean, it might also be, in this case, if the customer is the healthcare provider, what is that experience? And so some of these other businesses that grow up around, whether it's biosimilars or any other part of the pharmaceutical industry, if you're not providing a molecule, but if what you're doing instead is providing something that actually directly impacts the quality of the experience, that's something that ultimately is going to be very important throughout the entire industry, but especially in areas where the ability to differentiate molecules clinically gets more and more difficult. So, for example, with biosimilars, almost by definition, it's going to be very difficult to differentiate those medicines on a clinical basis. In a sense, you're trying not to, right? And so with some of those, to really be successful, one of the questions that comes up is, can you find a way to add something to the patient experience? So, for example, is that maybe an investment in a device? Is there a delivery device that actually becomes more important and that makes it easier for the patient to be able to administer for these large molecules? That's going to be really critical. Is there a smart aspect to that device, right, that communicates maybe with the physician's office, maybe with some of the other apps that are being developed to help patients be more compliant? I think we're likely to see a new wave of investment in some of these areas to help sort of round out things and look at things a bit more from the patient's perspective, which ultimately is what the innovation is all about, right? It's really about delivering innovation that's valuable from the patient's perspective.
I think Darren is touching on an interesting thing, though, right? This concept of value. One thing we haven't talked about today, we did touch a little bit on the Affordable Care Act, but the system holistically, whether it's services, whether it be IT, whether it be pharma, biologics or biosimilars, everything needs to come at a better value and a good patient experience, because we are moving to this value-based system versus volume-based system. And I think these are the fundamental underpinnings to something that will lower the average incident cost of a healthcare event 10 years, 20 years from now, which are fundamental in some of the themes we've been discussing today.
Great, thanks. What makes a company an attractive target in this space? Does that have anything to do with their stage in the FDA approval process, Christian?
Yeah, absolutely. It comes down to de-risking an asset. So obviously, the further along you are in the process, the less risky it is from the perspective of the pharma buyer. So, when we talk to companies, and in fact, I think when you look at the deal value or the number of transactions in the space, if it has an approved product and it's revenue generating, that's where many of these deals occur. After that, has the product been approved? And before that, is it in phase 3 or earlier? So you don't see a lot of M&A transactions in the phase 1 preclinical space unless it's a very unique target. So if it was another BTK inhibitor, you might see an acquisition, or if it's some other interesting class. These tend to be in oncology where you see these transactions. It's just much easier to get a deal done if it's approved or at least very late stage. And the key point tends to be after phase 2B data or randomized data where there's true proof of concept, and oftentimes phase 3 ready.
Darren?
It also depends, this is really just a bit further to Christian's point, it also depends on the specific therapeutic area, right? So there are just a few areas where a venture-backed or even publicly backed company is going to have the wherewithal to go all the way, the full distance, all the way through a phase 3 for even one indication, much less multiple indications. It's easier in some areas than in others. So certainly, for example, in certain small oncology indications, may be very well possible to find the public market be willing to support a company through one or even more indications because of the size of the investment that's made. Compare that, for example, to diabetes in the cardiovascular space, where the remaining regulatory risk, because of the safety hurdles, is still pretty high. And there, the public market is probably going to be a little bit more reticent to take on the amount of the risk associated with a phase 3. And so the larger cap companies are probably going to have to come in and accept that risk. And so they'll come in ahead of both the technical risk and the regulatory risk. But ultimately, in some respect, it ends up being the regulatory risk that's driving both of those.
Well, guys, we haven't run out of topics, but we have run out of time. I've been speaking with Christian Hodnelin of William Blair & Company, Adam Dolder of Great Point Partners, and Darren Carroll of Eli Lilly & Company. Thanks for watching.